My brother showed up to the hospital with a coffee in his hand and a real estate attorney's business card in his pocket, and I knew right then that our father was not going to make it out of that room the same man he went in. I was 29. I had been sleeping in the vinyl chair next to my father's bed for 3 days straight. I had rescheduled 4 client meetings, eaten vending machine sandwiches for every meal, and cried in the parking garage twice so my father wouldn't see me fall apart. And my brother walked in with a latte, kissed my father on the forehead like he visited every week instead of once a year, and slid that business card onto the bedside table like it was nothing. My father is 61 years old. He built a small accounting firm from scratch. Just him and one part-time assistant for the first 5 years. And by the time I was in high school, he had a real office, 11 employees, and a reputation in our county for being the most honest numbers man around. He taught me to read a balance sheet before I could drive. He let me sit in on client calls when I was 14. He used to say, "The numbers don't lie, sweetheart. People do." I became a CPA because of him. I work at a mid-sized firm now, not his, because we both agreed early on that mixing family and finances too closely was asking for trouble. But I knew his business inside and out. I helped him set up his bookkeeping software. I reviewed his contracts when he asked. I was the one he called when something felt off. My brother never cared about any of that. He moved to another state at 22, spent his 20s bartending and then doing something vague in logistics that he could never quite explain clearly. He called my father on birthdays and Christmas sometimes. He borrowed money twice and paid it back once. But he was the son. And in my father's family, in my grandmother's house, where the rules were set generations ago and nobody had bothered to update them, the son inherited. That was just how it was. I didn't think my father believed that. I thought I knew him better than that. The morning after my brother arrived, my father asked me to step out of the room so he could talk to my brother alone. I stood in the hallway for 40 minutes. When my brother came out, he wouldn't look at me directly. He said, "Dad wants to talk to you," and then he walked straight to the elevator. My father looked smaller in that bed than I had ever seen him look anywhere. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who filled a room without trying. Lying there with tubes in his arm and the heart monitor beeping slow and steady, he looked like someone had let the air out of him. He said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you say anything." I pulled the chair close, and I held his hand, and I said, "Okay." He told me he was leaving the firm to my brother. Not the house, not the savings. The firm. The thing he had built with 30 years of his life. The thing I understood better than anyone. He was leaving it to the son who hadn't set foot in that office in a decade. I asked him why. I kept my voice steady because he was sick and I loved him, and I wasn't going to fall apart in front of him. He said my brother needed it more. He said my brother had struggled his whole life to find his footing, and this was a chance to give him something real to hold on to. He said he knew I was already doing well on my own. He said I was strong and I would be fine. I said, "Dad, he doesn't know how to run an accounting firm." My father said, "He'll learn." I didn't say anything else. I squeezed his hand and I looked out the window and I thought about all the Saturday mornings I had spent in that office, learning things nobody asked me to learn, just because I loved the work and I loved my father, and I thought someday it would matter. I thought about my brother's face in the hallway, that sideways look, the way he couldn't meet my eyes. My brother had known what my father was going to say before I walked into that room. My father said, "You're not upset, are you?" I said, "I love you, Dad," and I meant it. But I didn't answer the question. I drove home that night and I sat in my car in my own driveway for a long time before I went inside. What I did not know then, what would only become clear months later, was that my father's firm was carrying a problem he had never told either of us about. 3 years earlier, he had taken on a significant contract with a developer who had then gone under, leaving an outstanding receivable of nearly $400,000. My father had been slowly covering that gap himself, quietly, without drawing attention to it, the way stubborn men do when they believe they can fix something before anyone notices it's broken. By the time he ended up in that hospital bed, the firm's actual financial position was very different from what it looked like on the surface. I knew this because I was one of the few people he had told, not to warn me away from the firm. Just because he couldn't carry the secret alone anymore, and I was the only person he trusted with numbers. He made me promise not to tell my brother yet, not until he figured out what to do. I promised, and then he got sicker faster than either of us expected. My father passed away 6 weeks after that conversation. It was March. The trees were just starting to bud, and there was still frost on the ground in the mornings, and I kept thinking about how he had always loved spring, how he used to say it was the only season that kept its promises. At the reading of the will, my brother sat at the table with his arms crossed and his chin up, already wearing the posture of someone who owned something. The attorney laid it all out. The house went to my mother. The personal savings were split between us evenly, and the firm, all of it, the client accounts, the lease, the equipment, the reputation my father had spent 30 years building, Went to my brother. My brother looked at me when they said it. He smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile exactly. It was the smile of someone who had expected to win and was pleased to be right. I signed what I needed to sign. I shook the attorney's hand. I drove to my office and I worked until 9 o'clock at night because I didn't know what else to do with the feeling that was sitting in my chest. My brother called me 2 weeks later. He had moved back to town, installed himself in my father's office chair, and apparently spent the intervening time looking at the books for the first time. He wasn't smiling when he called. "There's a problem," he said. I said, "Tell me." He explained it the way someone explains something they don't fully understand. He used the words wrong. He kept saying missing money when what he meant was an uncollected receivable that had been partially offset and partially deferred. I let him talk. When he was done, I said, "I know about it." The silence on the other end of the line was very long. "Dad told you," he said. "Dad trusted me with it," I said. "Yes. So what do I do?" I thought about that question for a moment. I thought about the vinyl hospital chair. I thought about the latte and the business card. I thought about the smile at the attorney's table. I said, "That's your firm. You'll figure it out," and I hung up. He called back 4 times that evening. I didn't answer. He texted twice, and the second text said, "Please, I don't know what I'm doing," and I read it and set my phone face down on the kitchen counter and made myself a cup of tea. I want to be clear about something. I am not a cruel person. I did not want my brother to fail, but there is a difference between cruelty and simply declining to save someone from a situation they walked into with their eyes open, wearing their confidence like a costume. My brother had accepted that firm knowing he had no idea how to run it. He had sat across from my father and taken something that was being handed to him, and he had not once said, "Are you sure? Do you think I can actually do this?" He had just taken it, and now he expected me to clean it up for him. I went to work the next morning, and I did my job, and I did not think about my brother's firm for the rest of that week. What I did not anticipate was my mother. She called me on a Sunday, which was unusual. My mother and I were not close. She had always been a little warmer to my brother, a little more comfortable with him in the particular way that parents sometimes have a child who just fits more easily into their idea of what a family should look like. She wasn't unkind to me. She just never quite knew what to do with me. I was too serious, she used to say. Too much like my father. She said, "Your brother is really struggling." I said, "I know." She said, "He needs your help. He's your family." I said, "He has a whole firm full of employees who know how to do accounting. He should talk to them." She said, "He needs you specifically. You're the one who knows how this works." I asked her gently why she thought I owed my brother my professional expertise after he had just inherited the thing I had spent my whole life preparing to help run. There was a pause. She said she didn't think this was the time to be bitter. I said I wasn't bitter. I said I was just asking a question. She didn't have a good answer. She told me to think about what my father would have wanted. I told her I thought about my father every single day, and I said goodbye, and I meant it kindly. I did, but I also meant it firmly. 2 months passed. I heard through my mother that my brother had hired a consultant, which was probably the smartest thing he had done. I heard that 2 of my father's long-term employees had left. I heard the consultant had flagged additional issues beyond the receivable. Some contracts that had not been properly renewed, a billing system that was outdated and leaking revenue in small amounts that added up. The firm was not in free fall, but it was not healthy either. And then I got a phone call from someone I did not expect. Her name was Doreen. She had worked for my father for 14 years. She was his office manager, the person who actually held the place together on a daily basis. She was the one who knew where everything was, who remembered every client's preferences, who had stayed loyal through every difficult year. I had known her since I was a teenager. She said, "I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I got your number from your father's personal contacts. He had it listed under in case of emergency." I said, "Of course." "Is everything all right?" She said, "Not exactly." She paused. "A few of us have been talking. Your brother is not a bad person, but he's not equipped for this. He's making decisions without understanding the consequences, and we've been watching clients leave quietly because the work isn't at the level it used to be. We don't want the firm to disappear. Your father worked too hard for that." She took a breath and then she said, "We were wondering if you would consider coming on as a consulting partner, just to stabilize things. You wouldn't have to be involved in ownership, just help us save what's left." I was quiet for a moment. "Why me?" I said, "Though I already knew. Because you're the one who actually knows this business," she said. "Your father talked about you all the time. He said you had the clearest head for numbers he had ever seen. He was proud of you. I don't think he said that to you enough." That last part landed somewhere I wasn't expecting. I told her I needed to think about it. I told her I'd call her back by the end of the week. I spent 3 days with that decision. I thought about my father's voice saying, "You're strong. You'll be fine." The way people say things like that when they mean it as a compliment, but it also functions as a permission slip to take less than you deserve. I thought about Doreen calling my father's favorite daughter an emergency contact. I thought about 14 years of loyalty from a woman who deserved to work somewhere stable. I called Doreen back on Thursday. I said yes. The arrangement was specific and in writing. I would come in as a consulting partner for 6 months, advise on financial strategy, help stabilize the client relationships, and rebuild the systems my brother had let fall into disrepair. I would be compensated at my standard consulting rate. I would have decision-making authority in my area of expertise, and I would not report to my brother. I would report to the partners collectively, with Doreen as the operational anchor. My brother did not love these terms. He called me the evening after the contract was drafted, and he said he felt like I was taking over. I said, "You called me 2 months ago and said you didn't know what you were doing." He said, "I know," but I said, "You have 2 choices. You accept the structure that gives this firm a chance of surviving, or you don't and you watch it close. Those are the choices." He agreed. I don't think he had any other option. I walked into that office for the first time in years on a Monday morning in September. It smelled the same, that particular combination of coffee and carpet and old paper that had been the smell of my childhood. Some of the furniture was the same. My father's certificates were still on the wall of what was now my brother's office, and I noticed my brother hadn't taken them down, which was either sentiment or laziness, and I chose to believe it was sentiment. Doreen met me at the front desk. She shook my hand, and then she pulled me into a hug that lasted a beat longer than a professional handshake usually does, and she said quietly, "Thank you for coming." The next 6 months were the hardest I had worked since my licensing exams. I rebuilt the billing system. I renegotiated 3 contracts that were about to lapse. I personally called the 4 largest clients and had real conversations with them about what the firm had been through and where it was going. I wrote new internal processes for quality control. I hired 1 junior associate who turned out to be exceptional. I was there before anyone else most mornings, and I left after most people most evenings. My brother was in the office. He tried. I will give him that. He is not a stupid person. He is an underprepared one, which is a different problem. He started asking questions instead of pretending to know answers. He started deferring on financial decisions instead of guessing. Slowly, carefully, the place started to feel like itself again. The clients stopped leaving. 2 came back. In February, the firm was approached by a regional network of independent accounting practices about becoming an affiliate member, a partnership structure that would give us access to shared resources and referrals. It was exactly the kind of expansion my father had always talked about, but never quite had the bandwidth to pursue. I shepherded the application. Doreen handled the relationship. My brother signed the paperwork. When the affiliate agreement was finalized, there was a small celebration in the office. Cake, sparkling cider, the whole thing. Doreen made a short speech about my father and what he had meant to all of them. A few people cried. I held it together until I got to the parking lot, and then I sat in my car and I let myself cry for a few minutes, the way I had done in that hospital parking garage, except this time it wasn't grief exactly. It was something more complicated than grief. My brother found me there. I don't know if he followed me or if it was just coincidence. He knocked on the passenger window and I unlocked the door and he got in and sat with me for a minute without saying anything. Then he said, "I didn't deserve it." "The firm. I know that." I didn't answer right away. He said, "I think Dad thought he was doing something good for me, and maybe he was in some way, because I wouldn't be here trying to learn any of this if he hadn't put me in the position where I had to. But you should have had it. You know that, and I know that." I looked out the windshield at the parking lot. A guy was loading groceries into his trunk across the street. 2 pigeons were fighting over something near the drain. I said, "Yeah, I know that." He said, "I'm sorry." I thought about whether to say it was fine. It wasn't fine, not completely, and I had spent enough of my life saying things were fine when they weren't. I thought about my father's voice. I thought about Doreen saying he was proud of you. I don't think he said it to you enough. I said, "I know you are." And then I said, "Let's just make it something worth being proud of." We sat there for another minute and then we went back inside. That was 8 months ago. The firm is stable now. The affiliate partnership brought in 3 new client referrals in the first quarter alone. Doreen got a raise she had been owed for years. The junior associate I hired just passed his CPA exam, and I took him to lunch to celebrate because somebody should. My brother is a better manager than I expected him to become. Not a natural, not what my father was, but he listens now, and he asks, and he has enough self-awareness to know where his limits are. That is more than a lot of people ever manage. I am still at my own firm. I reduced the consulting hours at my father's firm to 1 day a week, once things stabilized. My name is not on the door. That part still sits with me sometimes, early in the morning before everything gets busy, in the specific quiet way that certain unfairnesses do when you've made your peace with them, but you haven't forgotten them. But I walk into that office every Thursday and the people there look at me the way Doreen looked at me in the parking lot that first morning, like I'm someone they were waiting for, Like I belong there. And maybe the name on the door isn't the only thing that matters. My father used to say the numbers don't lie. He was right about that. But he was also a man who made decisions with his heart when he thought he was making them with his head, and he wasn't always right, and I loved him anyway. Completely, the way you love people who shaped you even in the ways that cost you something. There's a framed photo of him on the wall in the small conference room, just a candid someone took at a company birthday lunch years ago. Him laughing at something, the way he laughed with his whole face. I pass it every Thursday on my way in. I always say good morning to it. I don't think that will ever stop.